human rights have gained momentum over the past 3 decades. And I would say that this has culminated somewhat in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, although this is not the be-all and end-all. This is still one more stop on the way forward, one would hope. Now, Southeast Asia itself faces many challenges, including the fact that we have to deal with diverse political systems, that in each country you have varying strengths of the rule of law vis-a-vis the economy and other aspects of social life. And although the primacy of economic growth above protection of civil and political liberties might sadly be a common thread across the region. So competition over foreign direct investment, for instance, has resulted in a race to the bottom. And this is quite often coupled with weak access to remedies for those people who may find themselves victims in some way of violations, of rights violations. So this panel aims to highlight and identify the problems that are specific to Southeast Asia. But beyond that, also look at experiences that point to possible solutions, either from within the region or from elsewhere in the world. Trying to look at approaches or strategies that might mitigate these problems. That will also, furthermore, be of interest not just to scholars, but also practitioners that are concerned with the topic of business and human rights. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Robert Nkor-Kudeo is the director of the British Institute of International and Comparative Law, and his research is primarily in public international law. So this means looking at the legal aspects of business and human rights, and human rights obligations, due diligence, and access to remedies, which I believe will be the focus of his presentation today, with a specific focus on Indonesia and the case of, haze and pollution, and the kind of rights regime that we might expect from these sorts of situations. So, Robert?
Thanks very much. Thank you, Sol, for your very helpful introduction and putting it in context. I'm also grateful to my colleagues from the Institute for Human Rights and Business who do fabulous, innovative work. It's great to have you on the panel. Now, I'm taking one example of, sadly enough, very many in the Southeast Asian region of issues which involve human rights abuses, and in this particular issue, looking at the impact of business and its role within it. The context is we're increasingly aware of the abuses of human rights that occur by business. Traditionally, of course, human rights were only about the state and the individual. There's this binary idea. What's happening is that's beginning to be challenged, partly because we see, for many people in their daily lives, it's business and business activity which is actually affecting them much more deeply. It could be everything from pollution of the water, to issues of privacy, to issues of torture, detention, a whole array of different activities. And so that's the context in which we're increasingly aware of these kind of impacts. Now, the big change, the big development in this area have been the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And they created 3 pillars. They made it clear that states have a duty to protect human rights. We knew this, but in a way they've confirmed that. And that includes in relation to non-state actors, such as companies. And corporations have a responsibility to respect human rights, That does not mean they don't have to do anything. They actually have this responsibility, which I'll talk about later on. And then thirdly, the third part of the pillar, there has to be access to effective remedies. Often neglected part, but I'm going to focus on that a little bit later. What's important about what they say are three elements. Firstly, all states, not just some, have human rights legal obligations. And that doesn't necessarily mean the states comply with them, but they have them. In fact, every single state in the world has ratified at least one of the major global human rights treaties, including every state in the Southeast Asian region. And secondly, all corporations, no matter how big or how small, whether they're transnational or local, can violate human rights. Once again, that's often neglected. We tend to focus on the transnational, but actually it's all of them. And all human rights can be violated. We don't just pick and choose, they can do this, they can do that. Every single human right can be violated by business. So let me look at the particular example. I'll talk about it and then I'll explain the different aspects in which one could bring claims in these areas. And of course I'm doing it from an international law perspective. I'm an international lawyer, I practice international law, I'm an academic. So that's of course the perspective I bring to it. Now probably many of you are all too aware, sadly enough, of the Indonesian transboundary haze. There's been burning for this for at least 10 years, and it goes on. There's toxic haze that occurs from the burning of stubble, crops, and other things. And it's mainly being affected in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. And over 300 PSI, in other words, way over the hazardous level in Singapore just last September. Affects all the region, and in fact has already affected the economic growth within Indonesia. So there was an agreement back in 2003, 13 years ago, on it. Indonesia finally ratified it in 2014. So you thought, great, things will move ahead. Well, in fact, there was an introduction way back in 2009 of the Indonesian Environmental Protection and Management Act, which made it an offence to burn, to do these kind of burnings. However, there's an exception, where local wisdom, great terminology, local wisdom allows it. Local wisdom is defined as meaning the burning of land with a maximum size of 2 hectares per head of family. You'd have thought, fine, but when you look at the volume of people and how this is not being policed, we end up having the haze as we have today. So what are the possible legal actions? What are some ways of dealing with this? The first one is, of course, you can bring an action against Indonesia, either by another state, by a corporation who's affected by it, or by a victim of a human rights violation. And there could also be an action against the corporation, because very often corporations are involved in this. Let me give you an example. APP, which is the Asian Pulp and Paper Company, has been accused of being involved and being aware that down their supply chain there are these plantations which are being burnt to enable regeneration of that and to clear the area for further planting. So there's a clear issue that, for example, that there are supply chain issues for which they have not taken action. So it could be an action by the state or by an NGO. Okay, having given that context, how could you bring an action by another state? Well, there's a clear position, as many of you might know from the international law, of state responsibility. And that is quite clear. In a transboundary issue, a state does have obligations. They have the obligation to ensure that activities within their jurisdiction do not affect another one. And it's made clear by 2 cases of the International Court of Justice, the one there, and then the second one, the pulp mills case between Argentina and Uruguay, which says a state is thus obliged to use all means at its disposal in order to avoid activities which take part in its territory or under its jurisdiction causing significant damage to the environment of another state. Very, very clear law. So there's an obligation clearly on Indonesia. So one might think, great, so you can easily bring an action against Indonesia. The trouble is, in order to bring an action to the International Court of Justice or any other international tribunal, you need consent. States need to agree for that to be a tribunal. It's not like a court, say, in any of our countries where if you have an action, you can take it to the local court. You may not get very far in some countries, but you can. But if it's an action against the state by another state, they both need to have consented to the location of where it's going to be decided. And there is no coherent, consistent practice of that across the region. So we end up having the position that In fact, they don't want to do it. Why? Because of political difficulties, economic difficulties, reciprocity, and the simple lack of consent. So it's very unlikely one state in that region will bring an action. So where's our next way forward? The next way forward is to take an action against Indonesia by a corporation who's affected. Let me just clarify what I mean. Let's say you run a corporation which is maybe runs a series of hotels, and those hotels are in Indonesia, but maybe the company is located in Thailand, Philippines, Australia, somewhere else, but they're operating there. Haze comes, not surprisingly, you don't get many hotel residents. So there's a potential of an action in that instance by a company against Indonesia. Okay, how does that happen? Well, there's something called an international investment treaties, which are very much a familiar position. States agree, often it's bilaterally, that one state will allow inward investment by companies into their state on the agreement that they treat them equally and in the same way as they treat their own investors. So it's been a massive, there's over 3,000 of these treaties. At the moment you've probably heard of the one which affects, well, it could affect all of your region, or all of the Southeast Asian region, which of course is the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, of which, for example, Vietnam is a part and Singapore is a part. But I have criticisms of these. I'll give you a little cartoon to vaguely amuse yourself, which is these bilateral investment treaties, they're meant to be about the best interests of the states to encourage investment, but they put straitjackets on these states. They aren't exactly always in the best interests of those states. Nevertheless, that's supposedly what they're meant to be about. So a company could bring a claim against Indonesia and say, by you allowing all this environmental pollution, you are affecting our investment. We're not being treated fair and equally. And the claim could go, under these treaties, to an international body. You're not then dependent on Indonesian rule of law. And it's quite clear that environmental harm is a breach of human rights. There's a number of cases in Europe, in Africa, involving this. I just mentioned the last one, the African Commission on Human Rights case. All about environmental pollution by Shell, the big oil company. But you can't bring, under the traditional human rights treaties, an action against Shell. You can only bring it against a state. So they had to bring it against Nigeria. The African Commission found on every count Nigeria was breaching human rights for environmental reasons. But actually, will a company bring this claim? A company may not want to bring this claim because actually they have long-term interest in staying in Indonesia. They don't want to actually infringe their engagement with the Indonesian government. They don't want to risk their own investment. And it's simply uncertain what will be the outcome of this decision. So it hasn't yet happened, but my prediction is somewhere in the next few years there will be a case if this continues in Indonesia. So that's the second route. The next route is, what about those who actually have their human rights abused? What about those who are actually being affected? They're polluted in the air, in the water. Well, we come back to where I began, the guiding principles of business and human rights, which say the state must protect against human rights abuse. And that includes actions by non-state actors, actions by corporations, and where the state is complicit in this. And many states in the region, including, for example, Singapore, are complicit because they want to keep these businesses going. So they're very involved. In fact, Salil was talking about some of the activities he's doing in relation to Iran. And what happens is trade delegations go. And if you have a look at a trade delegation today, they aren't lots of people from the government. They're mainly people from companies who are in these trade delegations. Trade delegations used to be 20 people. They're now hundreds of people, mainly companies. So that is where the state is very complicit in this engagement. Okay, they're meant to regulate these corporations, and the Human Rights Council has made it very clear that includes environmental damage. Is this happening? Well, a little bit. There's some legislation in some countries, the Modern Slavery Act in this country. The US has introduced some legislation which has some effect. Just in the last month, the Council of Europe had recommendations about it. It is still quite weak and only in certain areas, but I think it is going to develop. A big area has been anti-corruption, the Bribery Act in the UK, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US. But the big difficulties are, how do you push towards compliance? How do you actually ensure that Indonesian government or any of the governments in the region will actually take this seriously? They're keener on investment, that's a hope, but they're certainly not keen on protection of human rights. Okay, if you feel we're struggling with getting action against Indonesia, actually there is some hope against action by the corporation. Let's take, for example, the Asia Pulp and Paper Company. Could you bring action against that? Well, believe it or not, there is some domestic legislation in the region. Singapore introduced the Transboundary Haze Pollution Act, which made both criminal and civil liability. It's quite impressive. It did take them 11 years to get to this stage, and very reluctantly, and a lot of pressure, a lot of internal anxiety. But great, fabulous. There is actually legislation in place that you can actually bring an action, including for activity which, and this is the kind of pollution that they've got, it includes activity which is whether it's inside Singapore or out. That's really very important. And they've brought, in this period, in the last 2 years, 6 preventative notices saying you shouldn't be doing that. Have we had any civil claims? No. Have we had any criminal prosecutions? No. So we still have this resistance. You might have brought in the law, but there's still very little action that's actually happened. And so what we end up having is a problem of evidence. How do you prove it? And the problem of prosecution. The state is too unwilling to do it. And even if you did, how do you find out the actual link between what they did and what's happening in Indonesia? In fact, there's just been a recent issuing of new photographs of the region which tries and pinpoints the plantations. They're still very hard to do. So we have, yes, this flag-waving legislation, but the reality is we're very, very far from actual prosecution. Okay, so if you haven't got national, can we go to international? This is where we come back to UN guiding principles. Because the UN guiding principles make it clear that the responsibility of a business enterprise is to avoid causing or contributing themselves or being involved in a way with a third party. And here we're largely talking about third parties, supply chains, those kind of things. And this is actually really crucial because we need to be able to hold companies accountable for their whole activities. Because their own responsibilities, I would say, is a no fault. They can't do it at all. So they're potentially negligent. But in relation to third party, there's a due diligence responsibility. And that due diligence means they need to act in relation to the impacts they cause. Not just their own risk, not just internal worries about it, but the own impacts they cause, including along the value chain. And they need to be able to use leverage, pressure, to change it. So, that's helpfully not seen that last part of it, which is just there's a couple of cases on this which indicate that it is possible to do it. There's a couple of cases, one in the Netherlands, one in the UK, which have pushed a little bit of the boundary to say a parent company has responsibility for a subsidiary. Many of you are commercial lawyers, you think, well, you can't go through the corporate veil. But in fact, they're finding the parent is directly responsible for the activity. So then we turn to what does a company need to be shown to be doing? And that is this notion of due diligence. They need a policy, but they need actually to undertake due diligence. Now, just so I don't offend too many people here, I should just say corporate social responsibility is not the same as human rights responsibility. And yet, time and time again, the companies which I speak to a lot, they say, oh yes, we've got corporate social responsibility. Corporate social responsibility is about protecting the company's own brand. It's not about protecting against the impacts they're causing on the ground. So, they are differences. And there's a difference between human rights due diligence and business due diligence. Business due diligence would be when one buys a company, you check what are the debts, what are the risks. But human rights due diligence is what is the impact, and that's not being done enough. So what's needed? You need consultation, You need transparency, tracking and implementation. And you can't just rely on the local law. Indonesia, as I've said, has the local law. That is not good enough. It's above just a compliance with the national laws. And we're just about to complete a project on what are the good practices on this area. Okay, I'm conscious of my time. There's a couple of slides left you'll be pleased to know. So the next point is, well, okay, I've said all this, the various claims. What actually remedies might we get at the end? Well, the state has to have provide access to judicial and non-judicial, and the companies need to provide grievance level mechanisms. The trouble is the balance isn't an easy balance, as that cartoon shows. The balance so often is weighted on one side. There's lots the state could do. They could allow courts and tribunals to take these activities. They could introduce non-judicial bodies. They could have, put in pressure to provide reports and other things require compliance with human rights due diligence. Often they can say, a good example would be the UK. At one level they say, yes, we'll allow this. Another level they say, but we won't give you any legal aid for it. Against these people who have no money in another country, they have no recourse to a remedy. The corporations, I think this is the way to begin a lot of pressure, is on companies directly. If the companies want action, they don't want to be embarrassed. And even the Singapore banks are aware of this. Singapore banks have put in place now expectation about having some kind of reporting system on these areas. And of course there's potential of a treaty, slightly involved in the movement in relation to whether there should be a whole international treaty on this. So where do we move forward? We could have interstate actions. We could have state legislation. As we've seen with the Singapore one, it's good, but it needs to have really strong compliance, not just regulation without impact. But what John Ruggie, who is the guy behind the whole UN Guiding Principles, made it clear, actually the state does need to take action. They cannot just rely on companies, because governments shouldn't assume that they're helping business by doing nothing. They don't help business that way. They need to do something. And also, of course, in looking at this, we have to also recognise that corporate practices are important. Corporate practice is often determined by risk. Lots of risks. Financial, operational, reputation, but also legal. And actually there's a lot of pressure from those, not just in the legal community, those generally. It does begin to change practices, as we've seen with a whole consumer boycotts on a range of different areas. I rather like this quotation from the Nike CEO. We do not like the fact that the Nike product has become synonymous with slave wages, forced overtime and arbitrary abuse. Companies don't like it. Look at the action they took after the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh. They actually took some action. And what's happening is this movement to becoming hard reliance, hard law, hard requirements. And law firms, just in case everyone's a law firm, also have an obligation, because they should provide good legal advice. So I guess what I would say is we need action by lawyers, we need action by civil society, but also these threats of litigation. That will begin to move things. Pushing companies to do better in terms of their human rights due diligence, pushing companies to be better in terms of regulation, but also making sure when governments finally put in place regulation, they also have compliance and enforcement techniques. That way, then, maybe some of the many actions we see of violations of human rights in this area by business in Southeast Asia is one way forward on reducing that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robert. I think what we'll do is we'll just continue with the presentations and take questions at the end. Okay. So I would like to now introduce our second speaker, Salil Tripathi, who is Senior Advisor on Global Issues at the Institute of Human Rights and Business. Now, Salil has worn many hats over the years, including having been foreign correspondent in Singapore and Hong Kong. But he's also been a researcher at Amnesty International. He's participated in the Kimberley process certification negotiations. He's senior policy advisor at International Alert, and at the time he played a key role in the process that developed the Red Flags Initiative. He sits on the External Citizenship Advisory Panel of Exxon, are you currently sitting?
Still there, not yet kicked out.
Okay, very interesting. All right, so I'll ask Salil to continue on his presentation,
Sure.
which will be less the legal framework as Robert has presented to us, but more in terms of the problems, the practical problems that the close ties between businesses and government present.
Yeah, there's a very simple reason for it, which is that I'm not a lawyer. So.
So we'll let you away with that.
Hmm?
We'll let you get away.
Oh, good, thank you. Yes. Although I spent 7 years at Amnesty, so a lot of it rubs off, you know. So I pretend myself. I've been mistaken for a lawyer and a PhD, so I suppose. And I'm neither, so yeah. So what I wanted to do was to talk about the practical reality of ASEAN and bring it very much focused on the region and look at what's been happening in the region politically on one hand, and what are the impediments for remedies to really emerge on the business and human rights plane. And to begin with, I want to talk about a couple of assumptions I'm making here. One is that one of the things that ASEAN is very proud of are the close ties between the government and business. Government works towards attracting investments, to create jobs. The whole rationale of ASEAN, if you were to look at it from the way it came about, I mean, and if you look at it from a very mercantilist and cynical view, you could say that it was the promise that was made by the US during the Vietnam War, that this region will have a very good security umbrella, and in return of which these countries in the region should remain themselves open for investment. And in return, American companies will invest, buy products, markets will be open, you will prosper, your security is guaranteed, don't become communists. That seemed to be like a kind of a bargain at that time. And I mean, that's one way of looking at it. There are many ways of looking at why ASEAN came about. I mean, many people like to play golf, so they like to have that. It's the world's one of the most exclusive golf clubs, isn't it? But anyway. So that close ties that you see between business and government is one of the major driving factors, because it also makes it, it makes it a rather difficult environment in which civil society tends to operate, because it tends to question both the government and businesses. And that makes it very hard for effective remedies to be developed for the kind of crisis that I will talk about, and the haze problem that has been talked about, because one of the cornerstones of ASEAN is non-interference in the affairs of your neighbors. So how can you tell a very large neighbor like Indonesia that our children can't breathe in Singapore? And that becomes an issue there. Now, the notion of business and human rights, as again we were told a short while ago, and which is absolutely true, is that it rests on the state having the primary responsibility to protect human rights. And it also implies another thing, which is that the state has a responsibility to regulate the conduct of business. Now, in Southeast Asia, the problem becomes that the state is often part of business. There are parastatal entities, companies owned by governments itself, companies having large stakes in the governments having large stakes in companies. Companies which are operating may have some amount of play on the stock exchange, but a golden share might be held by the government itself. And this is across the board. It's not necessarily restricted to only Indonesia and Malaysia. You find something similar in Singapore, you find something similar in Thailand, and so on. And in Thailand, there's the added element of businesses run by the military. Just as Indonesia once had very powerful businesses run by the military, but now they have made way for the families of earlier with the Suharto's children, and then with some of the large Chinese businesses. Now you also have a revolving door policy. So you have senior officials of ASEAN going from government to work in businesses with relative ease, and vice versa. And I mean, there is also this very close collaboration, because a lot of people are government scholars. They've been to universities together. There's a social class and social capital that gets built, and which makes this tendency to look at the glass half full rather than glass half empty each time a problem happens. And so it is in that environment the human rights groups which are fighting for the rights of migrant workers or laborers or trying to organize workers to form unions, it is in that environment that they operate. Activities get restrained, activists get arrested, human rights organizations, just as an example, would be Suaram in Malaysia, for example, find a lot of problems. The one that was set up in Singapore to look after migrant labor, even that has had problems historically. Trade unions are not to be trusted. When I moved to Singapore, local WAGs used to tell me that NTUC, the National Trade Unions Congress, meant never trust your union chief. So that's the kind of context in which a lot of things tend to happen. Now this is for two reasons. One is, of course, the primacy played on economic growth in much of ASEAN, and the idea that the collective good should triumph over the individual. If you rise, you might get chopped off. You know, the rising bamboo shoot is the one that gets cut down first. And the Confucian accord that, you know, rice bowl is full, so don't protest. Now, I'm observing this. I'm not making a value judgment. If you think that I'm critical of it, at one level I am, because the civil and political rights are at a disadvantage here and are not respected and protected properly. But there are obviously advantages, because ASEAN has made huge strides in removing illiteracy in vast parts of the country. Indonesia under Suharto had managed to make the country food self-reliant. He was called Bapak Pembangunan as the father of development, not because, not only because of his progress in achievements on the population front, but even in general terms about making a lot of things accessible on a lot of the socio-economic indicators of Human Development Index, not the civil and political, but socio-economic indicators. A lot of ASEAN countries do much better than other countries which are bigger democracies, such as India, where I come from. So that's definitely true. So now I'm going to focus on 5 instances very quickly, which would probably give an example of the kind of problems that occur and why it is so hard to get human rights remedies on the ground. The first case is actually, ironically, outside ASEAN, but it's a very well-documented case, that's why I took it. But it's in the neighborhood, it's in the region, and similar stories have happened elsewhere. And that involves the Porgera mine in Papua New Guinea and Barrick Gold, which is a Canadian gold mining company. The second is in Cambodia, and is the Boong Kak Lake case. The third will be the case of the copper mine called Lek Padang in Myanmar, on which I can spend several hours if we want, but I won't. The fourth is a very short interlude in the criminal defamation case involving Andy Hall, a British activist in Thailand, with the Nature Fruit Company. And finally, the plight of migrant workers across Asia and what it means. So let's turn to Porgera so that we have an idea of what happened. Now, in Papua New Guinea, there's a sprawling gold mine called Porgera, which has produced more than 16 million ounces of gold since it started operating about 25 years ago. That would be worth more than $20 billion at today's prices. Its worldwide operations are on track to produce more than 7.5 million ounces of gold, which would add another $10 billion in a year or two in Papua New Guinea. Now that mine has to be protected and it operates in a very remote area. Human Rights Watch has made a beautiful film which is downloadable on their website, and I suggest you look at it to see how they conducted the human rights investigation. What happened was that they had a private security force which had nearly 450 personnel in Porgera. And the mine had to cope with extraordinary security challenges, including violent raids by illegal miners, because people realized that this had value and they wanted to steal it. But what Human Rights Watch, when they did the research, they found that there was a lot of problem involved here, where the primary one of that being that it was a case of a lot of violent abuses committed by security forces for no apparent reason. And the worst of it was a systematic series of sexual assaults against women in the area. Human Rights Watch investigated 6 cases of gang rape by the security personnel. Initially, the company denied they took place. Then they said they are not our employees. Then it turned out that some were employees, some were former employees. And after a long period of denial, the company agreed that it was a disturbing instance. It investigated, it brought in the police, and now they have been arrested, and a couple of them have even been punished. The women who were interviewed, and a lot of other security personnel who were involved with these kinds of cases were then terminated. Their jobs ended. Police arrested 3 current and former Porgera employees in 2011, and out of them now there are 5 are in jail for inflicting grievous bodily harm on people. So the system did work, but it took something like from the beginning of the cases till the time of the arrest, close to about 8 or 9 years for even the cases to be registered. Now this, after that, of course, Barrick has gone bent over backwards. It has created a new system for a local remedy by bringing in international experts. and brought in a group of people whose job would be to try to make sure that such things do not happen again. Now, there is, of course, a voluntary principles for security and human rights, which intends to and aims and often succeeds in creating an environment which tells the security forces how to behave, how not to commit violations, how not to be violent, and how to use force proportionately and not disproportionately. But like most of the remedies that exist, which are not mandatory, which are not legally required, it's what we call the necessary but not sufficient condition. It helps, but it's not enough by itself, and that things can still go wrong. And yet we urge companies when we talk to them that they must do it, because if they do, go ahead and do it, the likelihood of bad things happening is less. And even more important, if things do go bad, if they have taken all these corrective steps, if they've done a due diligence process ahead of time, then they're likely to be able to convince to the government that, look, we tried our best, and therefore it may help in their mitigation of their argument. That we tried our best, but we could not, it was beyond our control. And we have to accept one more thing about this, that yes, companies are more visible, companies are more likely to have a face-to-face relationship with the community, but often the violator itself is the government. The security forces in Porgera are government forces, and the company can very well say that we have no authority over them. And international NGOs, local NGOs, everybody turns to the companies in a way because they've given up hopes on the government. And I think that's one of the primary problems of the way the business and human rights discourse is structured. And it's not a fault of businesses or government which try to do it right, but it's because of the laggards, those who don't want to do enough, and those who want to have a free ride on this, and which is probably one of the reasons of the frustration which has led to the call for the treaty. And we can talk about that later in the question of secession. Let me turn to the Bunka case, where there are 18 women who were very keen not to give up their land, which was going to be taken up to build, I think, a housing apartment complex and an office complex near a lake in Phnom Penh. They were protesting, singing human rights songs, and they were, without any due process, they were arrested. Some of them were beaten up. Within 2 days, they were tried. Defense lawyers were not given enough time to defend the cases properly. They were not given access to lawyers. Lawyers also didn't have access to all the information, and they were immediately sentenced for long terms. Now, the whole case is because there were people who had residency rights which were going on way, it's a 12.44 hectare land area in Phnom Penh, and they had leases which went much ahead and much beyond, but the government wanted to overturn it, and so about 600 families were to be moved, and with force. And moving people with force always creates a problem, and this is a great development imperative, not just in ASEAN, it's the case in China, it's the case in India, it's the case everywhere around the world. But there are certain steps that need to be taken. If you start talking about free, prior, informed consent, that becomes a problem, because indigenous rights activists say that that's a promise only primarily for the indigenous communities. Some other people argue that no, it should be extended to anybody who's vulnerable. Again, let's not get into that semantic debate about whether FPIC is only for the indigenous or non, but the fact is that it must be, a company has to make sure that the consultation is without fear, that it takes place before, that it takes place with people who have adequate information to respond to it, and at the end of it there is at least an agreement of what is going to happen, and there's fair compensation, rehabilitation and relocation. But the Cambodian case shows that that hasn't happened. And Human Rights Watch had said in its report that the trial failed to meet even the most rudimentary fair trial standards in violation of Cambodia's own obligations and its own laws. This is how they had concluded in that case. How much time do I have?
About 8.
Oh, good. So now let me turn to Myanmar, Let Padang. Now this is a copper mine which originally was owned by an East European country, and then it was bought by Ivanhoe Mining, and now it is owned by a Chinese company called Wanbao Mining. Wanbao Mining is in a partnership with the Union of Myanmar Economic Holdings, which is a very powerful Burmese company connected with the state. And they mine copper, and they wanted more land, and they thought none of the free, prior, informed consent steps were taken, and two women who were basically farmers growing vegetables in their plots, their land was being taken away. They decided to rise because this happened after 2011, when Aung San Suu Kyi was free. There was talk of democracy, there was talk of greater political participation, and respect for rights. And so she started challenging them. And therefore, immediately they were arrested. Not only were they arrested, but and as soon as they were arrested, other people started protesting. And once those protests happened, security forces were brought in. Buddhist monks got involved. And a lot of them tend to wear this nylon-like material for their saffron robes, not cotton, which catches fire easily, which is the whole point. Because when the military which was protecting the site, for whatever reasons, decided to use white phosphorus one evening. And a lot of their clothes got burned, they got burned, they were very badly injured, some of them had to be taken to Thailand for treatment. And after that, of course, the matter became very big and the operations were stopped. Aung San Suu Kyi was appointed to become someone to take a decision and as a commissioner to come up with recommendations on what should be done next. The recommendations she came with are primarily on the environmental and economic plane. She did not address direct human rights issues, partly because her mandate was restricted. Her mandate did not say that she should look at how the project was assigned at all, to start with. And she lost a lot of goodwill within the community, and people did push back when she came, and slogans against her were raised, which tends to happen pretty rarely. At least it happened very rarely in 2012 and 13. But that did happen. And after that, now you still have a couple of people who are still in jail. Donna was telling me yesterday that Anam Hon La, who's one of the main human rights defenders there was a report that she would come out. This is the week of the Burmese New Year and the Thai New Year. And the assumption was that she would be released. But as far as we know, as yet she's still a political prisoner and in jail. But Wan Bao Mining, to their credit, now have figured out and understood that they need to consult communities, they need to understand things better, and they need to have more communication. And have started talking to other stakeholders and to try to get it right, and which is indeed the way forward. Very quickly on Andy Hall, before I come to my concluding remarks. Andy Hall is a British activist, migrants' rights and labor rights activist who operates in Thailand. He wrote about abysmal conditions in which migrant workers work at a fruit plucking plant. And the company got very angry and it filed a criminal defamation suit against him. And criminal defamation in Thailand can mean a very long prison term. He was occasionally given freedom to get out of Thailand. And last year in Geneva at the UN Business Human Rights Forum, he was a panelist in a panel I chaired on human rights defenders in business. But later he again wanted to leave and he was not, and he still faces this problem. It is a freedom of expression issue at one level, but the expression, what he wishes to express, is to articulate the grievances of the workers, which is being denied. And that is a problem. I don't have enough time to go into great detail, but we must remember that Malaysia has the largest number of migrant workers in the region. 2 million Indonesians are there, including about 800,000 illegals. There are lots of Filipinos, Vietnamese and Burmese and South Asians. Singapore proportionately has a very high number of foreign workers, and around 300,000 Malaysians live and work in Singapore. All of that creates a problem which can grow up into a very serious crisis if the economic premise and the promise does not work out. And the bargain that has been made that your rice bowl is full, in return surrender your civil and political rights. We will ensure that your economic rights are guaranteed, but don't protest. And that might someday have to collapse. Now my point with all these cases is basically to show that essentially the ASEAN Compact, when the symbolism of those rice paddies tied together by that by rope, is based on win-win, that you give some, I give some, and both of us win. But there are certain relationships, because of the whole nature of power and the way it functions in ASEAN, are such that it doesn't always work out that way unless there is mutual respect for dignity. As long as economic growth is considered to be paramount and more important than other issues, friction will occur. Now, it can be won over if the economic growth is so vast that the rising tide and all the boats continue to rise. And if that happens, everybody will be fine and everybody will be happy. And it would not be. But we know from 1997, the crisis, which I covered as a reporter, what happens when things do go wrong. When Indonesia had a change of government, Thailand had a change of government. And who did Thailand turn to earlier when a crisis was there? Either it is a general like Suchinda Kraparun, or it is an IBM CEO like Anand Pannerachun. Now, nothing wrong with Khun Anand, who I met and who's a very brilliant man, but they completely lack political and social legitimacy. Now, of course, I mean, this is not a time to talk about Thai politics, but I mean, if you look at the whole story of Thaksin Shinawatra, it's like that if you were to hold an election, probably he would win again. And he does represent not a very pleasant kind of political order within the Thai setup. But if he were to come in power, the power elite do not want that. And that's the whole red and yellow revolution that keeps going on. And in all this nexus, you have the military, you have the business, and the power elite coming together. And what gets left out in this process is the community at large, whose rights are often at a discount. Now, to change that, one thing that would have to happen, change that equation, before we can talk about remedies for corporate abuses, is for basic human rights to be respected better in the context in which these countries operate. Unless there are independent national human rights institutions, unless there are independent trade unions, unless there are independent human rights NGOs which are able to hold power to account, we are talking about imposing an order from above, which could be very risky. Now, in that context, what should a company do? Not much actually, except to ensure that the steps it takes as part of its due diligence are very proper. It means that they must do a proper risk assessment. To do that risk assessment, they should talk to all stakeholders, including those who are critical. Try to take those considerations into their operational plans so that when they do want to ultimately act, they act in ways that do not undermine rights. And then once they operate and once they they try to be very transparent, operationalize their policies, keep it accessible, keep their officials approachable, so that in the end, they become friends not of Indonesia but of Indonesians, not of Singapore but of Singaporeans, not of Thailand but of the Thai people. And they have to secure that local license, and that comes by treating the communities in which they operate with dignity, by respecting rights, because then the basic link in this framework about how they can respect their rights in an environment where the protection mechanism may or may not work, at least there is some sort of a remedy and necessary steps are taken, although I will add, they are not sufficient. Thank you.
So much, Salil. The various cases really do highlight the intricacies and difficulties of addressing business and human rights, especially if we really go to the problem as being so fundamental in terms of political and social structures in these countries. And I would like to ask our next speaker, although this will not, I don't know if this will be a direct response to these specific fundamental problems, but maybe at a more practical level. So I'm sorry, let me introduce her first. Our final speaker for the day is Donna Guest. She is Senior Advisor on Southeast Asia for the Institute of Human Rights and Business, same institution as Salil, but also connected with the Myanmar Center for Responsible Business, which is an offshoot, if I understand correctly, of the Institute of Human Rights and Business. She has also written, so for this Myanmar Center for Responsible Business, she's written 3 papers on land rights, on civil society organizations in the extractive sector, and on indigenous peoples. She came to IHRB from Amnesty International, where she worked on human rights in Southeast Asia for over 20 years, and most recently served as Amnesty International's Deputy Director for Southeast Asia. So I understand that Donna will be talking specifically about Burma, Myanmar, and perhaps with a slant on more positive indications of how certain practical problems can be addressed.
Thank you, Saul. I worked on Burma for 27 years. I don't consider myself an expert because I don't speak the language. I've never lived there. But I've seen a lot. I'm going to be discussing a case study that my boss, Vicky Bowman at MCRB in Myanmar, and I wrote. It's going to be published in Cambridge University's Business and Human Rights Journal. MCRB has defined business, responsible business, as business that works for the long-term interests of Myanmar and its people. It bases a lot of its work on the UN guiding principles. This has been particularly helpful in an environment like Myanmar because the principles were signed off by consensus at the UN level, at the UN Human Rights Commission, so their council changed its name. So therefore, it has more legitimacy than, say, a European treaty. So getting back to Robert's comment on CSR, MCRB likes to focus more on, we'd like to shift it away from CSR because Asian companies and Myanmar companies in particular tend to see that as corporate spending. It's like, okay, we're gonna open a hospital, we're gonna have a school, and it'll all be fine. And so, there's a phrase, it's not how a company spends its money, but how it earns that money. And that is definitely, I think we're all in agreement there on that. I'm gonna focus on a few of the key positive and, and some positive changes, but also some of the challenges. Of course, as Salil said, the country's opened up. The NLD-led government is less than a month old. Sanctions, economic sanctions, were mostly suspended or in fact abolished beginning in 2012. So this is an almost unprecedented opportunity for businesses from abroad to invest. The climate for responsible business has improved because there's been more free speech, more peaceful assembly. The last government has tolerated a lot more civil and political rights. You can speak out, you can march. And this has made it easier for MCRB because they can publish their findings, and these are extensive findings, in both Burmese and English, and they can also conduct advocacy activities with the government at many levels. And this is also beginning to be true of civil society there. It's always existed there, but it tended to be more humanitarian and social and cultural. Now there's more freedom, they can actually do advocacy, they can actually start talking about human rights. There have been some consequences, there have been hundreds of arrests in the last 2 years. That doesn't mean all these people are behind bars, but it's been pretty tough. A lot of these people are land rights activists, a lot of them are labor activists, a lot of them are farmers who have done what we call plowing protests. This is a land they may have been on for generations. Maybe they've been on it for 30 years. And then they're just kicked off with no rights at all because the documentation is so complicated. The legal system, a lawyer very good lawyer I was talking to, a land rights expert, said it's kind of like doing a jigsaw puzzle without having the picture on the box. And this is a hotshot lawyer, so imagine me, anyway, or imagine most people. It's very, very difficult. So yeah, there's been a lot of positive developments because there have been some reform-minded individuals in the Myanmar government. And they've done some very transparent and accountable things. Now they're starting from a very low base, but nevertheless, got to start somewhere. This is, I think, is very important. So they're now Myanmar is now a candidate for something we call it is called the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. This means, in very simple terms, and I don't understand the whole thing, but anyway, what happens is that the government must report what they receive from companies in the extractive sector, so that's oil and gas, mining, blah, blah. The companies must report what they pay, so something called signature money. So this is a good, this is a very positive thing. The last government took it very seriously, they've submitted reports. They've also adopted some environmental impact procedures, which has just been, that just never would have happened before. There's new labor laws. For the first time in 50 years, independent trade unions are allowed. Strikes are allowed. Child labor is a big problem in the country. It's really being recognized now. It's a massive problem. Working conditions are a problem. They just put in a minimum wage of $3 a day. That's not enough, but it's better than it was. And then of course, there's been reform of the legal system with regards to land. It's very complicated. It's going to take a long time to fix, but they have begun to do it. And this has meant, with this reform process, again, free speech, but also people are out in the streets and they can now do that. But there are a lot of risks and challenges, and I'd like to refer to Salil's briefing that he wrote back in 2012 that in many ways is quite prescient, because a lot of this stuff absolutely played out. Some played out more than others. Some were bigger problems. The arrest and imprisonment, as I said, there were over 100 activists released last week before Burmese New Year, but there's still a lot of people left. As I mentioned, arbitrary acquisition of land from urban poor people, and also those living in rural areas. Now, people living in rural areas are estimated 70% of the population. These are people who are somehow involved in agriculture or fisheries or something like that. Their poverty level is significantly higher than it is in urban areas. But that's changing. Now that there's more investment, there are more garment factories, you've got the classical thing of people moving into Yangon, moving into Mandalay, and you've got a lot of people with no land looking for work, and it's very tough. Another issue is pervasive ethnic and religious discrimination. It's a very, very culturally diverse country within Southeast Asia, as you know. But there's been entrenched discrimination against the central Burman, the ethnic Burman people, against the ethnic nationalities, which is what they like to be called. They could be 30 to 40% of the population. Their areas occupy maybe 55% of the landmass. It's a lot. Myanmar is mostly Theravada Buddhist, but there's significant populations of Hindus, Christians, and Muslims. You may have heard about what's happened in the west of the country bordering Bangladesh, the people who call themselves Rohingya, who are Muslims. There's been horrible intercommunal violence between the dominant in that area. They are also an ethnic minority, but they're the dominant group, and the Muslims. And in fact, it's beyond that. It's been some targeted, and I have looked at this very, very carefully. I'm not, but only from reading a lot of reports. I haven't done field research in this particular area. But this has been a real problem. It started in 2012. Now the violence, and it also spread to, for example, Monwea, which the big earthquake on Wednesday, that was the epicenter. Fortunately, everybody seems okay there. And these are not Rohingyas. These are Muslims who've been living in the country. Some of them definitely some of them pre-British. So they're very, in many ways very established. But so there've been, lots of problems. There are now some 4 what they call race and religion laws, which means that, for example, a Buddhist woman has to get permission from the government and her parents to marry a non-Buddhist man. And it goes on and on. There's to convert. They try to limit population to, they don't say how many in certain deprived areas. It's a very bad package of laws that this sort of Buddhist, I wouldn't call them Buddhist nationalists because that's a contradiction in term, but they're Buddhist
chauvinists.
Radicals. Radicals is what they are. So that's been a huge issue, and it's gotten a lot worse. It's gotten a lot worse. Last week, 2 peaceful Muslim interfaith activists were sentenced to 2 years in prison. They've been in jail since July, so and then again, getting back to the ethnic nationalities, big group at independence, almost right after independence from the UK in 1948, they started fighting against the central Burman government. This was massive. It was all around. Burma's a sort of central plain, and then there's a sort of horseshoe around of mountainous areas, and that's where a lot of the fighting. I mean, it was everywhere. It wasn't massive, but there were so many different groups that, again, we go back to our jigsaw puzzle. How do you deal with all these people? And they've had these temporary ceasefires, which then, why do they want to give up their guns? They didn't get anything out of this. Some of these ceasefires were 17 years old. So they all broke down, and now they have some more, but they're still fighting in the north of the country. There are 100,000 people displaced. Many people, have been killed. Many civilians have been killed. New anti-personnel mines have been set. So all these issues are a problem for business, for any business, if they're in that area. Now, responsible businesses tend to not want to go to those areas. But then what happens is you get other businesses who may have arrangements with the central government, but may also have arrangements with the dozens of opposition or militias or whatever. So it's a big mess. And so there's new sort of spate of land, sort of grabbing land and land disputes, because there's been a bit of a spike locally in some areas around the country. And so that has meant that, people who, at least there may have been fighting, but they had their land, or people who've been displaced, there's still at least 140 refugees in camps on the Thai border, and those people are still there. And what happened to their land? Does it have, mines planted in it? Is somebody else there? Probably. So all these are land, labor, and then really the issue of complicity. There's a lot of so-called cronyism, people who are close to the government, and now some of these cronies are trying to be better. Some have even helped fund various NLD activities, and some have even engaged with MCRB. I mean, they're trying. But there's still travel and visa bans, and also bans on financial services by the United States. The United States, I'm an American, I'm a loud American, but still, it kind of controls the, like the money, right? I mean, things have to go, because it has a lot of influence on the World Bank, international finance.
The dollar is what everything is tends to
Yeah, and so
measured in,
in the old days, you would see, and I'm talking not very long ago, you would see guys, and I talked to Burmese business people about this, you would see guys with giant suitcases of absolutely crisp $100 bills going to Singapore to be deposited, but it has to be crisp money. So whenever you go to Burma, and I've been 15 times, I wasn't banned, my organization was, you had to have these you still have to have absolutely perfect notes. So you come in with this wad of money, it's crazy. Anyway, so that's, these things are all problems. I mentioned the security, the armed conflict, the ethnic ceasefire areas, and yeah, business relationships, it's tough. But there have been a couple of good global conditions. One Robert talked about, which is these new standards, most notably the UN Guiding Principles, but you've got the ADB, you have World Bank, you have the International Finance Performance Standards. Now, these are not mandatory, but if you want to get money from the international, part of the World Bank body or from the Asian Development Bank, you have to comply with these if you want to get a loan. So it's and a lot of companies who don't necessarily get money from these institutes are still looking at these performance standards and really trying. So that's a good thing. And yeah, I think in terms of MCRB, there's several reasons. There is a beginning of the business and human rights discourse. They're starting to use terms like responsible business. I'd like to read a very short quote from a Mon ethnic nationality in the Mon language press. It is necessary to invest. After the investment, if the projects cause negative impacts, we have to reduce the negative impacts as much as possible. These terms would be unheard of 5 years ago. And MCRB has had an impact on working with civil society and helping them to meet with companies and try to get the best deal in their communities. We've also embarked on massive, they're books, sector-wide human rights impact assessments, which we've got 4 different sectors. One is oil and gas, one is information communication technology, one is tourism, and the next one is going to be mining. And these are all growth areas, and that's why they were chosen. Why didn't we choose agriculture? It's very political. The price of rice is very political. The control of the rice market is very political. This harks back in some ways to the British days. They turned Burma, Myanmar, into one big rice plantation. It had the highest, now, the conditions for the local people, I don't know about that, not good. But this is the fantasy of a lot of people in Myanmar. So we chose these, we thought a lot about it. And another thing is transparency and accountability. Myanmar companies are beginning to see what that means. What MCRB does is looks at the websites, if there are websites. First it did the 60 biggest companies, then the 100 biggest companies. And that is, all they do is what's on the website. Human rights policy, environment policy, labor policy, land policy. Don't measure them, but just, and it was, the companies began to compete with one another. So the top companies actually started having this little competition, and that was an improvement, and this is a good project, and it just means that people are, Myanmar companies are beginning to understand it. And in conclusion, some other factors. One salutary example that is it's not like Salil's example, but it's also a Chinese company, the Myanmar Dam, which is at the confluence of two rivers that go into the Irrawaddy. This is of cultural and national significance. The whole country got behind not having this dam. The Irrawaddy in Myanmar is not dammed at all. And also the Kachin people, who are an ethnic nationality living there, have their own cultural significance, and they're going to lose land, and a lot of other things that happen with dams. So that brought the country together. Now, in September 2011, then President U Thein Sein announced the suspension, not the cancellation, but the suspension of the Myanmar Dam. That is when I started believing in the process. That is when I knew that things could change. And that's a business and human rights thing. It's not civil and political, it's not, and I spent my life doing civil and political rights, and also looking at forced labor and other issues. But, so this is a salutary example, because what happened, of course, is how much money did this company lose as a result of the suspension? What's happening now with the NLD government is now their calls, let's just cancel the whole thing. I don't think that's going to happen, but we'll see. I don't like to predict because I just don't. But we'll see what's going to happen. I think the calls will continue, but there may be less, really strident protests. But that could change. So I think, the fact also that there are international companies that are coming in now, they're talking to each other more because they can see it's high risk. They can see all these risks. So they're kind of, they don't ignore their competitive, nature, but they get together and go, what do you do about this? And MCRB has been able to work with that, like with the ILO, the International Labor Organization, convening a quarterly meeting with OECD, with people who are countries that are in that. That includes Japan, South Korea, lots and lots of countries. So any company there have to agree to certain standards. And in an odd way, the decades of military rule, failed socialism, human rights abuses, and cronyism has led to a lack of trust among the people, the government, business. MCRB got feedback in its very early days, and some civil society organizations were suspicious. That's changed, but it goes deep. So addressing this lack of trust has, in a perverse way, it's given us an opportunity. And MCRB has the sort of positioning and the knowledge, and everybody on staff except one speaks for me. She's learning it. She is a Chinese national, so it's all very helpful. So can this model work for other countries, new investment destinations? It's very difficult to say. In fact, IHRB has two other centers that were open roughly at the same time, one in Kenya and one in Colombia. Now, they haven't been closed down, there's been plenty of investment there, but it's beginning to make a difference, you know, at the policy level, government level, and with the companies. So whether MCRB could work elsewhere remains to be seen, but it's never been done before, to our knowledge, so it's pretty interesting. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much. So if I try to summarize in a couple of words, the model that you refer to is MCRB being an international NGO effort working with local or businesses in Myanmar, the government, and civil society and international organizations in a sort of comprehensive, multi-stakeholder kind of way.
Yeah, yeah, but it's, you know, the struggle is for it not to just be a international NGO coming in, which is not that they're all bad, but almost everybody is a Burmese national. The director, Vicky Bowman, who used to be the ambassador,
She speaks fluent Burmese.
fluent Burmese.
Translate literature from English to Burmese.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, she gets it. She's lived in the country for almost 10 years off and on. So it's got a lot, without this kind of history that, so it's not personal. It's a big, it's different. Yeah, that's what's good about it. Thank you.
Excellent. All right, so let's open up the floor to the first question or comment.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Dr. Min Zan from Professor, Faculty of Law, Multimedia University, Malaysia. Briefly, if I may, only in the form of brief comments or addendum, thank you, Professor McCall-Cadales, for mentioning the difference between HR, human rights, and corporate social responsibility. I am skeptical from years back of the word CSR. It's a sort of camouflage. I am even skeptical of R2P, responsibility to protect. Yes. Look at what they did in Nagis and other wells. It seems pompous, I mean, cliches being reproduced by the UN or other things. So, but previously, about 10 years ago, the catchword among ASEAN elites is non-interference in the internal affairs and Asian values. It has reduced somewhat a bit, but here now it's CSR and others. That is my comment. Yeah. The second comment about Mr. Sandel, about Lebanon and Aung San Suu Kyi. The former president, Raymond Horta, right? He said to be understanding of Aung San Suu Kyi. I mentioned to my students a couple of times that I am not an unqualified admirer. There are vicious attacks against her on the other hand. There are also adulation as though she is mother of God, if I may use that example. But Rohingya issue, Bengalis. She did not mention it, and basically she has been critiqued on that. But the other thing is that, of course, she needs the Buddhist vote. Let's face it. She needs the Buddhist vote. And she cannot say that. But Lebanon, there is no racial issue. But she was not only not outspoken, she is almost the sounds of silence, I mean, regarding Lebanon. So that is my second comment. The third comment is about Donna, about the full race and religion law. This time I will come some, like Professor Robert Taylor has been called pro-regime scholar. I may risk that thing. I have spoken out against yesterday morning in the session about the full law. But if I may make a comparison, I don't know whether there are anybody from Malaysia. Malaysia has such a law for 50 years. If I may, I read the draft in Burmese language. The religious conversion law does not require the non-Buddhist man to convert to Buddhism. Yeah. It says that when there are Buddhist images, Buddhist worship, going to monasteries, you cannot interfere. You cannot impede the wife practice of that. For me, I'm irreligious personally. For me, that's not outrageously wrong, not bad. Because in Malaysia, in all states, for 50 years now, whether the man marries a Malay Muslim or even non-Malay Muslim, or whether a woman marries a Malay Muslim, you have to convert. If not, it is unlawful cohabitation. I'm wondering, of course this is 50 years old, I'm wondering, I even write to ICJ, an American Iranian, on Facebook, Why is there no protest, no much word from the international community, from women rights activists about this thing in Malaysia? I'm not defending the Burmese thing. In Malaysia, there are case law. You abduct the husband, abduct the children, forcibly convert to Islam, and they do that. As far as I know, and they sometimes do not allow people to the Mount Everest climber. He was converted to Islam secretly, and they don't allow his wife to get the body back. As much as I know, to that extent, it has not happened in Burma. Thank you.
Yeah, I think with regard to race and religion, it's really pretty hilarious because one of the laws, I think it's sorry, I missed one law. It's the Adultery Law. And it's no adultery, no living together, no nothing.
Yes, yes.
Okay, there have been a handful of cases brought. These are by Buddhist people who are
Yes.
angry about their spouses having an affair with somebody else or leaving them. This is, I mean, I love it. It's just not what the law was intended for. And but these laws are very frightening, and Suu Kyi's got a lot to handle to try and get these off the books, along with a lot of other laws. But those laws, they just came into force. The Buddhist monks, some of them are militant,
Yes.
as you know, and it's frightening. It is quite frightening.
Okay, I'd just like to make an attempt at sort of drawing things together a little bit, because I think that a large part of what we've been talking about so far has been democracy, and in some cases democratic reforms is essentially, or as integral to a process that allows for business and human rights, say, access to remedies to be even possible. It seems that what I'm getting from each of the speakers is that it's been implied, but in non-democratic situations, it's probably very difficult to even begin to get the most basic recognitions of redress for victims of human rights abuses that have to do with businesses. But I think what we would probably want to do is to focus really more on the question specific to certain cases, perhaps, or the legal frameworks that really are relevant to how businesses having no legal or very little legal responsibility for human rights protection. And that's where the tension lies, right? Yet being directly or indirectly responsible, they're not being necessarily held to account, but they are in many cases responsible for gross violations of rights. So if we can try to bring it back to that level of discussion, I think we'll have a more productive way of addressing this question.
Can I try?
Yeah.
Exactly what you said, and drawing on what our friend from Malaysia said, and tease out what Letpa ought to look like, if you had the right framework. So the problem with Letpa is such that the copper mine is there. It can't go away. Fields can't be planted again. So there's no year zero to go back to. There is a mine, and there is activity, and there have been past injustices. What can Wanbao mining do today? Very briefly on what you talked about Aung San Suu Kyi and the sound of silence. This happened in 2012, and she was out of jail in 2011. I'd met her a couple of times in those days and so on. And a lot of us had an image of hers, that she was going to be like Václav Havel or Nelson Mandela, and be a global champion of human rights. But she was always clear. She told us in one of our meetings that I'm a politician first. And it's a pragmatic way of looking at it. I'm not saying politicians are bad and statesmen are good. That's a nice normative discussion we can have elsewhere. But I think what she was trying to do is that I have to do what is achievable. And she was given a mandate which only said that she has to talk about the environmental issues and of foreign investment and what can be done. She was not even told to look at the security aspect. We wrote a report which we never published, but there's nothing secret about it. It's just that the moment passed, that's why we didn't publish it. in which we had gone into some of that, that if those voluntary principles for security and human rights were in place, then white phosphorus would not even have been considered to be used, because it is used to control crowds when there is mass violence. Against that, yes, the Geneva Convention does allow you to use it. But it's like, people are coming and shooting and that kind of. Here there were these Buddhist monks who were sleeping in a tent near a particular pagoda, I think. And then they had tossed the bombs there. There was no justification for it. Now, I would like, all of us in this room would have liked Aung San Suu Kyi to have spoken more about that. Her logic was that I had to be acceptable to the international investing community as well. So that was probably her subliminal response. But if Banba Mining were to be looking at this case today, what I would do as the CEO of the company would be to go to MCRB, for example, or its equivalent. I mean,
They have actually.
no, I know. But I'm playing out beyond.
Right.
Now I'm playing out what is beyond that.
Yeah.
What they've done with the MCRB is having consultation, what can we do next? But MCRB's advice is not binding. MCRB can only say, go and talk to people. When you go and talk to the people, they are not going to listen to you. You should have the willingness to suspend operations as long as it takes, regardless of copper prices, regardless of what Beijing tells you, regardless of what the Chinese army tells you because it needs copper to scare off everybody in South China Sea or whatever. Yeah? You have to do that, and you have to listen, and you have to earn back the trust, because ultimately the relationship between a company and the community is built on trust. If that is broken, and when the power equation is so lopsided, where the company has all the power and the community, the only way the community will respond is either by a stupid act of violence or by stopping your operations from going on. And that gets on the CNN, on news, on the Guardian front page and all that. So to avoid it, they have to start that conversation, and they have to begin their trust by engaging with the community more, identifying what they want. Now those two women are farmers and they grow vegetables. What can the company do to ensure that they can have a sustained livelihood? Why should they have to grow the vegetables and go all the way to the city to sell? Instead say, okay, you grow these vegetables, our workers need potatoes and tomatoes, you grow them for us. Work out a system so that you can integrate the community in your economy. Now these are selfish activities, but they also help generate the economy. Some people will call it CSR. I don't care what it is called, but all these are ways to what I said at the end, the social license that you want from the local community. Now none of this is required, there's no textbook for it. It just requires a changed focus of looking at it and placing the community which is being affected at the center of your operations. And these are autonomous decisions that the companies have to take. Government won't require it, civil society won't necessarily be there to hold your hand, but they have to do that. And I think that's probably the way forward in all these environments where companies are operating, where governments are either unwilling or unable to protect rights.
I'm conscious that there's someone who wants to raise something, but just very briefly, Robert, do you want to add?
I was going to add a couple of little things. Firstly, pick up your point of CSR. CSR could be inclusive of human rights, but that's not been its practice. I think you have people in CSR roles who could well be good at this. I think what they need to do for that is to put the business case a bit better, because there is a business case on human rights. If you treat, for example, women equally, you end up getting better productivity. If you don't have a supplier who has child labour, your reputation isn't affected. There are strong business cases for this, but it's rarely put in these kind of locations. And if I can just pick up one thing Sol mentioned, democracy and human rights are, of course, not the same thing.
Yes.
So we've got to be careful not to sort of link them too much. And of course, you could say Singapore's a democracy, Malaysia's a democracy, Indonesia's a democracy. Of course, human rights abuses go on. I loved your point about how the state is desperately, involved in business in so many ways that it's not in their self-interest. So I guess that what I would say is that there needs to be some pressures on companies and through NGOs, etc., that can make changes which force it to be a bit more democratic than it is, rather than the same. And I'd make just one other quick comment, which is that although you mentioned the copper mine and that there's a sense to which there can be boycotts and things, there are many, many goods which are not consumer goods, which no one goes protests about.
Yep, absolutely.
And that's really hard. I was reading in a different region about the situation in Zimbabwe where they put a company is using ethanol and all these same terrible things, And no one knows about it because it doesn't sell internationally at all. And so we have to be careful not necessarily to lay it purely on relying on consumer pressure. Because sometimes it won't be any.
Absolutely agree.
Yes, please, in the back.
A quick comment and then a question. So just on business behaviour, or Western business behaviour, non-Western countries, it's absolutely right. The standards of local behaviour must always be held to account. It's worth bearing in mind that sometimes the standards that the best of them bring can be higher than the standards prevailing locally. The way they treat their staff, sometimes their attitudes towards the environment, certainly health and safety as well. We'll see this story unfold in Myanmar. It's not because they're especially altruistic or virtuous, but because their own home state, civil society, and legislation, sometimes, UK Bribery Act, for example, hold them to account. The energy companies in Myanmar, for example, at the moment, very, very anxious about partnering with local counterparts and being unwittingly complicit in corrupt practices. The due diligence they have to carry out on local partners, very, very expensive. That requires local partners all down the supply chain to demonstrate to the satisfaction of international investors that they are compliant with, for example, UK Bribery Act requirements. Now, a question, if I may, to Robert. So, very, very interesting, still the example you gave about the Singapore Hayes Act. Now, if I understood correctly, this is a piece of legislation that's being passed that imposes criminal liability on non-Singaporean entities operating outside of Singapore. There's an extraterritorial element there. I wonder if you could comment on how innovative that is and whether it's a model elsewhere. But more generally, just to come back to some of Sol's comments a moment ago, tell me if you agree with this proposition that, on the one hand, corporations are increasingly acquiring rights, particularly through the business investment treaties and so on, but they are not acquiring corresponding obligations under international law, under national legislation, yes, but not under international law. There seems to be an imbalance, something wrong with that story, or maybe just wrong with my understanding of it. It'd be great if you could comment on that.
I'll let Sulu pick up the second part. In relation to the first part, yes, it is as far as I know, the first example where Singapore has passed a law in relation to an activity which is not in Singapore. But you have to bring an action against somebody who has some location in Singapore. They can't go and bring an action against someone who's located in the Philippines. There has to be some base in Singapore. They have to be operating in Singapore, have to be domiciled in Singapore, registered in Singapore. That has to happen.
What about the stock exchange? Sorry.
Okay, yes, they could be registered on the stock exchange. For example, that's how they get Asia Pulp and Paper, because they're on the Singapore Stock Exchange as well as the Indonesian Stock Exchange. So they have to have some jurisdictional link with the company, but their activity can be elsewhere. And I went and spoke to the Attorney General's Chambers, which is the lawyers who put in place this act, and they were deeply nervous. This was the first time ever Singapore had done such an act. And in fact, they had the support actually of an awful lot of international law on this, that they could do this, at least for environmental matters. So you've understood it well, except that, just to be clear, it can't be anybody. They have to actually be located in Singapore in some manner.
I mean, it's, in a way, this is leading up to the question about whether there's a need for a treaty for corporations, because corporations are acquiring certain rights but not obligations. I'm still ambivalent about a treaty purely because having the kind of treaty that is on the NGO's wish list will take 40 to 50 years. Or it will take a very long time, if ever. Because the campaign against torture took 30 years to get a torture convention agreed to. So, and that was such a simple case that you don't treat someone in a cruel and inhumane and degrading manner. So this will take much longer because of two primary issues. One is, where does the actual responsibility for a particular abuse lie? To what extent is it the direct contributor or direct actor, perpetrator, versus complicit in the act? I don't know the answer to that, because in many cases that you see in civil and political rights abuses particularly, companies are accessories or acquiescing with it, contributing to it, benefiting from it, supporting it, or supplying materials for it or something, but never the actual perpetrator. That's usually a non-state actor, or it is a state actor itself. So that's one conceptual problem I find with it. And the other one is, of course, unwillingness on the part of state to give up what they consider to be their primary obligation. I mean, one of the prime opponents of extending the Rome Statute onto companies back in the time when that was being discussed was France. Because France was basically arguing that this means you're creating another center of power, which is not a state actor, which is going to be obligated to international treaties on genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The argument I would make is what you will find in a report that was prepared by FAFO and International Peace Academy, now International Peace Institute. It is a study of 18 jurisdictions around the world, including Malaysia, where they have looked at the applicability of existing criminal law and the extent to which it applies to companies for the trans-border operations. Now there are many, now this is an argument, it has not been tested yet, but the argument is that companies have sufficient powers to go after it through simple things like Sale of Goods Act. If somebody is bringing timber from Liberia and there have been abuses made and therefore it is tainted timber, for example, the Sale of Goods Act, this was the argument Global Witness lawyers used to make, that under the Sale of Goods Act, Denmark can stop that timber from entering the country. Okay, I mean the whole Burmese action became such a big one was because there were laws passed by the Californian state saying that thou shalt not unload goods that come made by forced labor.
Massachusetts and
California, sorry. California, and you're right, both of them had done it. So there are things like that that can be done under existing law, and those are probably easier wins than trying to have the treaty. But that said, I think the idea of having international law liability applying to companies is good in principle if there's a clear case can be made that it is primarily the company's responsibility for the specific abuse to have happened. The big problem today is that people tended to use the Alien Tort Claims Act in America. And that was a civil case, it was extremely difficult to mount a case, and now that window is almost closed. And I think increasingly we are going to need domestic jurisdictions and domestic courts to start taking these cases seriously. And which brings us back to the old question, that the states have to step up to the plate and do what they're expected to do.
So if I can just follow up.
Sure,
Sorry, there are actually some cases, a couple of which I mentioned, within Europe, which are not relying at all on the Alien Torts Claims Act, and do enable action to happen. But there aren't very many, but there are those possibilities. At the same stage, they are all for actions that happen a long way outside those states, and that seems to me much better if they could begin close to home where the actions happen. Sorry.
But Liberia is a good example because Goose Van Koevenhoven was one case and Frans van Anraat was another case, one in Iraq and one in the case of Liberian timber, where the Dutch court actually stepped in. In one case, punished someone and increased the punishment. In the other case, exonerated because the evidence wasn't enough. So yes, there are these applications of law, but again, it's the same principle that you identified with Singapore, that in each case this was a Dutch national who was behaving badly abroad. So this complete universal jurisdiction, which Belgium once argued, is not possible.
Donna, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you very much. A couple of things just in terms of some of these cases that you guys are probably more familiar with than I am, but Total in Belgium and Myanmar. Now, settled out of court, and so did the Unical case in Myanmar in the state of California. But, you know, there are problems with that, and nobody knows how much they got. Well, we kind of, well, anyway, who knows?
Very well kept secret.
Yeah, it's a very well kept secret. So there's Unical, there's Total. I mean,
Shell gave money in Nigeria to Ogonis, recently.
Yeah, so I mean, it's, you know, you settle out of court, it's really, well, I'm not a lawyer, so I just won't say anything on that. But I did have a question to ask, make a comment, and then a question for Robert about bilateral investment treaties, about which I know. But because it's now become a big issue in Myanmar. They've signed one with Japan, they're gonna sign one with the EU. There's been MCRB and Margaret and others, IHRB have had a lot of input into this whole process. And again, it's the feeling that this could bankrupt Myanmar, because these cases tend to be, they're arbitration cases, they tend to be tried in Singapore, right, if for this area. So they could be, and what if the NLD government signs in some really good new environmental legislation, some really good new health and safety, which is on the books, and or it's getting through the Attorney General's office. You know, it may be in Parliament. They sign this stuff into law, and then a year later, you know, they sign an agreement with a bilateral investment agreement with, I don't know, South Korea. I don't think they have one. So what do you think?
You raise a great point, hence I'm always a bit dubious of bilateral investment treaties. But let me give you an example of what you're saying. Argentina privatized their water industry, and then a couple of years later they realized actually they weren't protecting the poor to have access to water, so they introduced water laws to protect the poor. What happened? The water company brought an action to an international body because they said, well, our profits are being affected. And guess who won? The company.
Yeah.
It is a real risk that, and that's where people like Margaret are important to say, Burma, you need to include in your bilateral investment treaty some ability for you to change laws on environment, on health and safety, on human rights, and that could not then be a ground for a case. That's not yet been the instance to date, but I think there's a better chance with Burma because of their advice. But there's a real risk that companies just say, don't do this or we won't invest. And it becomes a pressure, you know. Do they get more money in or do they protect human rights?
And also, I know for a fact that some reformers at a lower level who will remain, not at a low level, but who I hope remain. You know, this point has been explained to them. These are good people. And, you know, they're kind of overwhelmed. And I think the NLD could end up being overwhelmed because they're just, what do we do? You know, and it's really, can I make a few comments about Myanmar with regard to your comments earlier, which is, you know, bringing in higher standards. You know, that's great. One obvious thing that happens, you know, if you looked at Timor-Leste, if you looked at Cambodia, countries that opened up, you get a competition for English speakers. And so all the English speakers tend to hop around a lot. And that, you know, go for the highest money. I do not blame them after decades of not having any opportunities. Then, with regard to oil and gas, for example, there's some, you know, good Myanmar oil and gas services companies or oil and gas companies. So who would you want to, you know, sign up with? I mean, these are okay, but these are just some of the issues that any, you know, I hate the word emerging economy, and I really hate frontier, you know, but these are issues that are going to face these, you know, already facing these countries, and you can see this around the world, you know. So that's what I see.
Okay, I'm hoping that someone else would like to raise a point or a question, or perhaps share an experience from a different country that hasn't been discussed, or from one of the countries. But because we might as well take advantage of the kind of expertise that we have around here at the panel. If you have a specific case that you know about and would like to comment on. Or perhaps a point of relevant to the concept of business responsibility when it comes to human rights. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you everyone, that was really interesting. I guess this may be directional towards Robert, but something that worries me is when a state employs a private security firm and then the citizen can't make a human rights claim back against the firm. Do you ever see maybe that changing? Maybe it's into like a chain of custody, perhaps the wrong term, but an extension of the human rights responsibilities of the state.
Yes, because in previous days we often called them mercenaries, but we're not allowed to call them that anymore. Yes, there is actually quite an interesting development on this area, private security companies. There's a development called the Montreux Doctrine, where there's these companies, in order to be able to be employed by the states which have agreed to this, have to show that they have undertaken various training in human rights, in international humanitarian law, and those kind of things. At many levels that's pretty weak. They're not saying
that you have to show you have not abused human rights or whatever. So it's still a long way from it. But oddly enough, it's an area which has moved because they are so linked in with the state. And so it's easy to kind of use the state's human rights obligations as a way to open that avenue a bit more. But as the examples which Salil used, it is very difficult when the state is complicit in the security forces' actions. I see developments on that. I would still say we're a long way from making them stronger.
Thank you. Oh, yes, okay, now we have to, maybe you first.
Hi, my name is Ajeng and I'm currently studying at Essex, doing LLM in Economic, Social, Cultural Rights. And this business and human rights issue is very, very new for me, but also very interesting. I would like to ask something, maybe it's very short, but with regard to the protect, respect, and remedy framework, if I'm not mistaken, there is one principles about redress, like making sure that when the company provide access to remedy to human rights violations that they did, for example, they should provide redress for the victims of human rights violations. I was just wondering how this redress will look like. I mean, like, would it be something like just compensation, or could it be something beyond material compensation to these victims? And I was just wondering if we can link the access to remedy to using the UN for example, any UN mechanism, for example. Thank you.
Okay, I can answer that in a couple of ways. The first thing is the general principle under international law is a notion of making reparation, and so the remedy terminology is clearer, but the remedy does not need to be financial compensation. That's a general principle across all of human rights. And in fact, the best example of some innovative thinking is the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which has done things like say that the state has to develop some new schools, put up monuments to victims, to actually employ somebody in certain ways. So it does not have to be purely financial. It could be classically, exactly, put them back in either, if not in the place they were, in a place which has an equivalent form of land. So it has not just you displace them here, dump them here, and there's a classic instance where that has happened in Peru, but actually, if you're going to move them from there, and there may be sometimes reasons for a dam or whatever, that could be a good reason, then you need to put them in the same location which has the same facilities, the same access, the same nature of the land, etc. So it does not need to be just financial.
And housing too.
Yes, housing is a good one. There's
It's
not much,
really
much
important.
on that, but that could be a very good.
And that is through the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, General Comment 12. Anyway, whatever, you know what I mean.
I do.
Yeah. But so you actually, there's something called forced eviction. It's defined in law by this general comment. And so therefore, there's a basis. It's what we call soft law, would that be soft law?
Yeah.
But it's there.
And then the problem which picks up your second thing, and that's an excellent example by Donna, is you can only go to a UN mechanism if the state has agreed for you to be able to go to a UN mechanism. So that's its slight.
And all other remedies have failed, and the state is,
So it's like a transitional justice.
It's called transformational reparation is the terminology used by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Finally, just one point, there's a brilliant person who's at the University of Essex called Sheldon Lee.
it's
who I
good.
recommend you go and talk to.
Actually, could I follow up on her question as far as the UN as a forum is concerned? Is there's a universal periodic review where states have to report now, and for better or worse, it's something
Been
that
more effective than we thought.
exactly. But for the guiding principles on business and human rights, is there a similar, at least a sort of reporting forum where states can be named and shamed potentially or anything like that?
The only thing that has happened is, see, we've been around 7 years as the institute, and I think the first 4 years or so we had funding to prepare shadow reports for countries that were coming up for UPR, and we chose those which had an interesting business and human rights narrative, and we put recommendations of what states should ask as questions or what states should ask as recommendations. But the success rate was very low, because what happens is that when the state comes for UPR, usually, you have a laundry list of items, treatment of, and so the role of business and human rights is kind of an afterthought. The maximum they will say, please prepare a national action plan. That's what the government would tell them. And such a mechanism for the companies just doesn't exist. I mean, people are trying to make it with looking at the GRI report, but that's very, very inefficient and insufficient. The only point I would make about the remedy question that you had is that John Ruggie had come up with 8, I was looking on my iPad for the document, but I couldn't find it. But he did come up with principles of what a good grievance mechanism and remedy system should look like, and which is worth looking at. One of the main points he makes, and which is always worth noting, is that this is not a substitute for the court of law.
Yeah, that's very nice.
Because everybody tends to think that, oh, we beat up 3 people, 1 is dead, let's do a grievance mechanism. No, that's when you do need the court of law, when there's a grave abuse. I mean, that's a given. This is ideally useful in contexts where there is a dispute such as land, like eviction, water being contaminated, and then some kind of a compensation, either cash or kind, is possible.
If you have a look at Guiding Principle 31 of the Guiding Principles, it gives you some of those kind of...
I think that's the one, where he has those 8 or 9 criteria. And I had a slide, but it's not on this iPad, unfortunately.
Okay, we'll take one last comment or question.
Picking up on the land issue, like in the Philippines, there's a development from right to access to land now to right on equitable distribution of the produce of the land. So I'm talking about like in Mindanao, where there are a lot of plantations. Farmers are being trapped into contracts that have inequitable terms, just because they are not able to negotiate it on equal grounds. So these contracts are being enforced by the state because they are contracts. The state thinks that these parties entered freely into a valid contract. But in essence, there is no equal footing, because these farmers do not even know the language of the contract, and they just know that there's there's money that they will get. And then it also evolves into another form of getting back the land from the farmers, because of these contracts. And these contracts, you cannot question with the courts, because again, the system protects contracts. So
it's like a land grab, but
legalized
contractual,
land grab.
yeah.
So one question, is this when the state is taking over land for its own purpose, or is it for on behalf of a private company?
On behalf of a private company. These
Okay.
are multinational
Right.
private companies that...
So the state is not involved?
The state is not involved, but the state allows it.
But it enforces the contract. The state
Yes.
is the enforcement. So this is a fundamental problem. There's a researcher in India called Usha Ramanathan. She's looking at the cases in India, and this is a problem of eminent domain.
Yeah.
That you have a piece of land which the state wants access to. Now, typically that is for a quote-unquote public purpose. But here it seems to me that it is for a private purpose. Unless it's a food distribution company or food manufacturing company, which wants to take over for commercial agriculture. Now that makes it a different issue. So I'm not sure of the specifics of the case. But if it's for private purpose to build a school, a hospital, road, apartment complex, golf course, anything like that,
It's public.
then then it is not, then it's a private, I mean, it may have public use, but it's basically for a private benefit. And that's when there is a real problem, and that's when that's why there is I mean, this is still a rhetoric, that a lot of people are challenging the whole notion of eminent domain there. That the state should not have eminent domain except for really essential reasons, and most governments don't do it. The only I mean, again, I'm not a lawyer, as I said at the beginning, but the only hope I see here is if in the Philippine constitution, which is quite pro-people, particularly,
Yes.
Post all your people power revolutions one after the other.
Social justice.
Yes, I mean, you have a lot. So if you have something that can, I grew up in India and we had something that, if there was an agreement which was against conscience or something like that, a phrase like that if it violates principles of natural justice, then you can go under what you have with a writ petition or, as a public litigation to the court and use it. But I think your system is probably the American, which is different. But there must be some way that if there is a concrete, the phrase in India, and it's probably from British law, is an illegal, immoral, or against public policy. If there is a contract of that nature, then probably you have the farmers have that remedy.
The other area would be duress or unconscionable.
Right, unconscionable, that's the word I was looking for, yeah. That's right, yeah.
Now, did you want to add?
No, I think Robert has.
No, I mean, I think Sue has picked up what I was saying. But I wouldn't completely despair, because it is a matter of what's often called equality of arms, when somebody is not in an equal position in negotiation.
Yeah.
However, sometimes because these farmers do want to enter these contracts, not only for the reasons you say, because their land tenure is not clear. So it goes back to the state. The state has probably not given them land tenure, so they're not clear of their rights under that land. So the state can have some responsibility within that process. But I certainly would encourage you to bring actions and keep on bringing actions to keep on asserting that these contracts are not fair and equal.
Aside from the action, what we're doing is we are training the farmers to have that capacity to negotiate properly with them.
Yeah.
Yeah. But again, litigation is also another way.
Are you from an NGO or?
Yes, I work with the NGO, but and also with government.
Okay, all right. Good position.
Yes,
very good position.
Well, actually on that note, because we have about 5 minutes just for maybe like a couple of words that you'd like to say in conclusion if you want, but I think that perhaps, we started out the session talking about the UN process of trying to hold businesses to account, even if the connection might be a little tenuous in some cases. But then there's been a lot of discussion in the course of the last 2 hours, really on domestic legislation, domestic institutions, civil society groups, NGOs, academics. So maybe if you would like to just say a couple of final words on this sort of working at different levels and what we can try to look forward to, what can be done going forward.
I'll take up the mantle just very quickly to say that international pressure makes a difference domestically. It'll vary state to state, it'll vary group to group, but it gives both support and encouragement for the kind of groups you're talking about. It also gives a legitimate standard, not just saying we don't think, but wait a minute, there's an international standard which doesn't think that this is appropriate. And that changes the debate. And also changes it, if you're criticising Singaporean government, Indonesian government, Myanmar government, you're saying there's international standards here. It's not just the US doesn't like, or France doesn't like, or the UK doesn't like. It changes the debate. And I think that's really crucial in a human rights matter. Because human rights matters are not just about what we're allowed to have because the state lets us get away with it. It changes in the whole debate so that actually human rights are about protecting from below, not just deciding from above. And I think the international regulation is of course from above, but it also helps from below to give a language as well as a kind of a justifiable standard to make the argument.
Can I just follow on from that? I mean, I think that's a very good point, and I think, of course, I always think Myanmar is a good example, but in Southeast Asia in general, with some exceptions, I would say that there is a respect among governments for the United Nations. And they take it seriously. Myanmar takes it very seriously. They got into the UN very early on. They had U Thant, who was, by all accounts, an excellent Secretary General. This is important to them. This is really important to them. And with the International Labor Organization, they signed very few of their conventions, or rather ratified. One was Convention number 29 against forced labor. I am sure they are very sorry to sign that in 1955, because man have they paid and man should they pay. I talked to hundreds, literally hundreds of people who've had to do forced labor for the military. This is not a corporation. This is, you know, although that could be argued is going to happen or could be happening. So I think that's a really important thing, that even countries that seem, you know, hermetically sealed off from the rest of the world, and Myanmar was never sealed off. That's a, you know, it wasn't like that. But they do have respect for some institutions, and they will. It takes a long time, but you know, it can happen. So yeah.
Just a few, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. Just to add a couple of things is that foreign investors, if I were to talk to them, I'd say don't confuse elections for democracy. Don't confuse democracy, and don't confuse democracy for human rights, and don't confuse a government for the people.
Absolutely. Very, very real.
Well, in keeping with the Southeast Asia theme, this discussion has really been like honey to a Malayan sun bear as far as I'm concerned. Let's thank our wonderful panelists and our